They laughed at her as if it were a joke, mocking, cruel, and utterly unthinking. A black woman seated in a sterile, bright-lit room felt their blades and whispers cutting deeper than any razor ever could. Her dignity stripped before their eyes, every snicker felt like an echo of a world that refused to see her worth. But beneath the fear, a quiet fire burned, a strength they could never touch. They didn't know who she truly was. They didn't know that one day she would sit where they now cowered, in the judge's seat, holding their fate in her hands. From a young age, Amara had learned the subtle lessons the world whispered to her about who she was, or who others thought she should be. Born and raised in a small town where opportunities seemed reserved for everyone but people who looked like her, she became familiar with invisible walls, sideways glances, and the quiet, unspoken judgments that followed her everywhere. Her mother had always told her that intelligence, patience, and resilience were her greatest tools, and she clung to those words as she navigated classrooms where teachers underestimated her, and streets where strangers assumed she didn't belong. Despite the weight of those assumptions, Amara excelled. She threw herself into her studies, her mind a sanctuary against the world's cynicism. Law fascinated her, not merely as a career, but as a way to balance the scales that so often tipped against people like her. She studied, memorized, and worked tirelessly, driven by a quiet determination to claim a place where her voice could no longer be ignored. But life had tested her patience in ways she could never have predicted. One afternoon, a seemingly routine encounter with local authorities turned humiliating. They laughed as they humiliated her, cutting her hair, mocking her in front of others, and dismissing her as though she were nothing more than a spectacle. That day, the cruel laughter of those who wielded power without conscience etched itself into her memory. Yet Amara didn't allow anger to consume her. She kept a quiet vigilance, honing her skills, watching, learning. Every injustice she witnessed became fuel for the fire she carried inside, a fire that would one day burn so brightly that those who laughed at her would feel the weight of accountability. Her journey from that sterile room to a courtroom of her own would not be immediate, nor easy, but it was inevitable. Years passed, and Amara's resolve only grew sharper. Every promotion, every case she handled, every courtroom she entered became a small victory against the shadows of prejudice she had faced. She wasn't naive. She knew the world would never fully welcome her. But she was determined to command respect on her own terms. Her rise in the legal world was steady but scrutinized. Colleagues often assumed she was less capable, clients occasionally doubted her authority, and adversaries attempted to undermine her with veiled insults and subtle dismissals. Yet with each challenge, she learned more about the mechanisms of power, the fragile egos of those who wielded it unjustly, and the importance of preparation and patience. What had once humiliated her would eventually serve as her greatest advantage. Then came the case that would define her career. A local incident, a small skirmish blown into a spectacle by authority figures, had left a community outraged. Among those responsible for the humiliation and injustice were officers who had long skirted accountability, protected by systemic indifference. Amara recognized names and faces, the memory of the laughter, the mocking whispers, the careless cruelty. They had not faded. She prepared meticulously, studying evidence, building arguments, and gathering witness accounts. Each document, each testimony, each precedent became a weapon, a way to ensure that those who had once made her feel powerless would finally encounter the weight of the law. She rehearsed in private, imagining the moment when she would stand before them, not as a victim, but as a force of authority. The courtroom itself became a stage of tension long before the trial began. Whispers spread among the officers and their supporters when they learned who would be presiding. They tried to mask unease with bravado, attempting to recapture the arrogance that had once defined their interactions with her. But Amara's calm composure, her quiet confidence, and her unwavering gaze unsettled even the most self-assured. Day after day, the trial intensified. Emotional testimonies, evidence of misconduct, and undeniable proof of abuse layered one upon another. The audience could sense the growing reckoning, the inevitability that justice was no longer a distant hope, It was imminent. Amara's presence in the courtroom was magnetic, commanding attention not through intimidation, but through precision, intelligence, and the silent authority of someone who had endured and emerged stronger. By the time the trial reached its climax, the tension was almost unbearable. Every officer who had once laughed at her, every individual who had assumed she would never rise above their cruelty, now faced her judgment, not as a threat, but as a rightful arbiter of justice. The humiliation she once endured had transformed into a formidable presence, a reminder that the echoes of injustice could be confronted and answered with unwavering dignity. The day of reckoning arrived. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffling of papers and the occasional nervous cough. All eyes were on Amara as she entered, her presence commanding a respect that no badge or uniform could demand. The officers who had once laughed at her sat stiffly in their seats, their confidence wavering under the weight of history finally catching up. As she reviewed the evidence one last time, the memory of that humiliating day, the laughter, the scorn, the careless cruelty, flashed vividly in her mind. But instead of fueling anger, it steeled her focus. Every argument she made, every ruling she handed down, was precise, unyielding, and undeniably fair. She spoke with clarity, her words cutting through excuses and denials like a scalpel, exposing misconduct in a way that no bravado could obscure. The courtroom felt electric, the tension almost tangible. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that the woman they had mocked was now the authority that would determine their fate. They tried to maintain composure, but Amara's unwavering gaze left no room for arrogance, no space for dismissal. Every smirk that had once accompanied their cruelty was replaced with silence, a quiet acknowledgement of accountability that they could neither escape nor challenge. Witness after witness testified, each account reinforcing the narrative of injustice. The evidence was irrefutable, and Amara's steady command ensured that the courtroom understood the gravity of the offenses. The air seemed to thrum with anticipation, the sense of poetic justice nearly palpable. Those who had once wielded power carelessly were now powerless, stripped of pretense in the presence of her unwavering authority. When the final verdict was announced, it resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. The officers, once symbols of mockery and impunity, now faced the consequences of their actions under the impartial eye of the law. Amara, composed yet resolute, had transformed what had been a moment of humiliation into a triumph of integrity and justice. In that moment, the scales had finally been balanced, not through revenge but through the undeniable force of accountability, courage, and dignity. The courtroom emptied, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than any applause. Amara remained seated for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just unfolded. The officers who had once humiliated her would carry the memory of this day for the rest of their lives, not as a badge of power but as a lesson in accountability. What had once been their laughter now echoed back to them as silence, a silence that spoke volumes. For Amara, the journey had not been about revenge. It had been about justice, integrity, and the unwavering commitment to prove that dignity could never be stripped away permanently, no matter how violently challenged. She had turned pain into purpose, humiliation into authority, and prejudice into a testament of resilience. The lessons she had learned in her youth, whispered by her mother, and etched into her spirit, had come to full fruition in this moment. Strength was not about retaliation, but about rising above cruelty with courage and clarity. Word of the trial spread quickly, inspiring conversations far beyond the walls of the courtroom. People began to see that the struggle for equality was not abstract. It was lived, experienced, and fought for every day. Amara's story reminded the world that injustice could be confronted, and that those who endured it could transform suffering into empowerment. Her triumph was symbolic, a beacon for those who had ever felt dismissed, belittled, or unseen. As she walked away from the courthouse, Amara carried more than the satisfaction of justice served. She carried hope for a world where power is held responsibly, where respect is earned through actions, and where those who are underestimated can rise to redefine authority on their own terms. Every step was a reminder that the echoes of oppression could be answered, not with bitterness, but with unwavering resolve. In the end, Amara's story asks a question for anyone who has faced prejudice or injustice. When the world doubts your worth, how will you choose to rise? Will you allow the cruelty to define you, or will you transform it into a force that reshapes the rules, commands respect, and leaves an enduring mark on justice itself?